There's a moth outside your window right now, throwing itself at a light bulb, and it has no idea why. For millions of years, its ancestors steered by the moon. The trick was simple and beautiful. Pick the brightest light in the sky, hold it at a fixed angle, and you fly in a straight line. The moon is far enough away that the angle never changes. It works perfectly. It worked perfectly for longer than our entire species has existed. And then a heartbeat ago in that story, we started hanging lights that aren't the moon. The moth locks onto the bulb the way it was built to lock onto the moon. But the bulb is close, so the angle keeps shifting, so the moth keeps correcting, and every correction curves it in tighter until it's spiraling around at 40-watt light all night for nothing. The software was never broken. The world just changed and the software didn't get the memo. You know this feeling. It's late. You're meant to be asleep an hour ago. And here you still are circling something on a screen, pulled in by a light your brain treats as important because a much older version of your brain decided it was. That's what this whole series is about. Not that people got dumber. That we're all modern moths running beautiful old software in a world it was never written for. Here's the thing about you that you almost never think about. The instincts you run on were not designed for the life you're living. They were designed for a very different one, a very long time ago. Anatomically, people like us have been around for somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years. Civilization, cities, writing, agriculture, the whole built world is maybe 12,000 years old. Call it 500 generations, and 500 generations is nothing. It is nowhere near enough time for evolution to redesign a human being for city life or office life, or a life where a glowing rectangle in your pocket can put the anger of 10,000 strangers into your hand before breakfast. So you're carrying around a set of instincts tuned for a small group of people you'd know your whole life on a landscape where the biggest information source was the person standing in front of you. Irvin calls that older instinct-driven part of you the primitive mind. It isn't stupid. It kept your ancestors alive through everything that could kill them. It's just doing its job in a world that stopped matching its instructions a long time ago. Same as the moth. Here's what that mismatch actually feels like from the inside. Because it's not abstract. It's happening to you constantly. Someone you've never met leaves a nasty comment under something you wrote. Nothing physical is at stake. No one can touch you. And yet your heart speeds up. Your face gets hot. And for the next 20 minutes, you're drafting and deleting a reply to a stranger instead of living your life. Your body just ran a threat response. The same ancient alarm your ancestors needed when the threat was a rival who could actually get you thrown out of the group. And in their world, that alarm was correct. For most of human history, being cast out of your small band wasn't an insult. It was a death sentence. There were no other bands to join, no other food, no other protection. So evolution built you to care desperately and automatically what the people around you think of you. That instinct was survival equipment. Drop it into a world of 7-inch screens and anonymous strangers, and the same equipment has you circling one cruel sentence at midnight, flapping around a porch light, certain it's the moon. That's the pattern under everything we're going to talk about this season. The instinct isn't crazy. It's just answering a question the modern world stopped asking. Tim Urban has a way of making this land. Imagine all of human history written as one fat book, 1,000 pages, each page covering 250 years. Almost everything you would recognize is on the final page, not the final chapter, the final page. Your country, your city, the light in your ceiling, the internet, this video, all of it crammed into the last sliver of the last sheet of paper. Turn back even a page or two, and you're already in a world with no writing, no wheel, no memory of you at all. And it's not just that the recent stuff is recent. It's that the pages are speeding up. Grab someone from the middle of the book and move them forward one page, 250 years, and they'd manage. Different clothes, same world. Do that near the end and it stops working. Take a person from the second to last page, drop them onto ours, and the shock alone might kill them. Metal birds in the sky, a voice from a slab of glass, more information crossing their eyes in an afternoon than crossed their ancestors in a lifetime. That's the vertigo I want you to sit in for a second. The world your instincts were built for is hundreds of pages back. The world you actually woke up in this morning is the wet ink at the very edge of the final page, and it keeps changing faster. Every year, the light gets brighter and closer, and the ancient software behind your eyes keeps doing the one thing it knows how to do. Lock on, correct, spiral. But here's the one thing you have that the moth doesn't. The moth can never notice it's circling a bulb. It can't step outside its own instructions and go, wait, this isn't the moon. You can, right now. Reading this, you're doing the thing no moth has ever done. Watching your own mind from the outside and asking whether it's steering by something real. Urban's name for that part of you is the higher mind, the part that can reflect, update, change its mind, and occasionally catch the primitive mind mid-mistake and take back the wheel. It's the part that, halfway through typing the furious reply, quietly asks, do I actually want to spend my night on this? And sometimes, not always, puts the phone down. And this is the whole ball game for the season, so I want to say it plainly. You are not a smart person or a dumb person. You are both minds all day long, trading the wheel back and forth, clear-eyed about some things, completely captured by others. The engineer who reasons carefully all day at work can go home and believe something insane about a topic that scares him. And it's not because his IQ dropped on the drive home. It's because a different part of him picked up the wheel. The only question that ever matters for him, for me, for you, is which mind is driving right now. So when you look around at the moment we're living in, the arguing, the conspiracy theories, the sense that everyone has lost their minds, and you ask what is wrong with people, I think that's the wrong question. Because the hardware didn't change. Nobody woke up dumber than their grandparents. The porch lights got brighter, and there are a lot more of them now, and they're in everyone's pocket. And before this turns into a comfortable evening of watching me diagnose everybody else, let me be the first one on the table. I circled a light this morning. I've caught myself more than once wanting you to feel clever for following along because a part of my own primitive mind would enjoy that and address the wish up as teaching. That reflex, the little hit of at least I'm not like them, is not the cure for what this book describes. It's the single best example of it. Keep an eye on me. I'm going to keep an eye on you. Because here's the uncomfortable part, and it's where we start next time. You already know how to think clearly. You do it every single day about 100 different things. Which route to take, which pan is hot, who's lying to you. And then there are a few specific subjects where you cannot do it at all. Same brain, same day, total difference. Next time, why the way you think has almost nothing to do with how smart you are, and everything to do with which subject just walked into the room. At 2 in the afternoon, you are one of the great thinkers of your generation. The subject is mattresses. You're buying one, and watch yourself work. 9 tabs open, reviews cross-referenced against other reviews, and you've already caught one website quietly ranking its own sponsor first. So its opinion went in the trash where it belongs. An hour ago, you were sure you wanted memory foam. Then the evidence shifted and you shifted with it and it cost you nothing. No embarrassment. You changed your mind the way you change lanes. Now it's 11 at night. Same day. Same skull. Someone on the internet is wrong. Not about mattresses. About the other thing. The one you defended a family dinner with your voice going strange. Your heart rate is up. You can feel it. And notice what's happened to all that beautiful research machinery from this afternoon. You're not gathering evidence anymore. You're gathering ammunition. You knew your conclusion before you started typing, and every link you're hunting for right now was chosen because it arrived there. Same brain, 9 hours apart. One of them was learning. The other one was winning. This episode is about that difference and about the uncomfortable fact that the difference was never you. There's a question you ask by everyone all day long. What do they think? Which side? Which stance? Which team? It's the only question our whole public conversation seems to know how to ask. Tim Urban's book is built on a different one, not what you think, how you got there. He gives it its own axis, running vertically, and a tool to go with it, a ladder with 4 rungs, 4 ways a belief can arrive in a head. We met the 2 roommates last episode. The higher mind treats a belief like a draft, something you revise because every revision means you're a little less wrong than you were. The primitive mind treats a belief like a membership card. It got installed early. It came from the people who keep you safe, and revising it doesn't feel like progress. It feels like betrayal. The 4 rungs are just the gears between those two owners. And here's the part everyone forgets within 10 minutes of learning this framework. So I want to say before we start, the rungs are not types of people. There's no such thing as a high-rung person. There are only high-rung and low-rung moments, and you will cycle through all 4 gears before you go to bed tonight. Gear 1, Urban calls thinking like a scientist, and you already know how it feels because it's mattress mode. You start from, I don't know, which costs you nothing to say. You read the sources that agree with you and the ones that don't. Your skepticism runs at one setting for everybody. And when the evidence turns against your favorite, you count it as a save. Better to be wrong now before you've paid. There's one more move in this gear, and it's the one that separates it from every gear below. Before you commit, you go looking for the strongest case against your pick on purpose, because an opinion that's never taken a punch isn't knowledge yet. It's a guess wearing confidence. Top rung thinking isn't some discipline you need to acquire. You do it every day, easily, brilliantly, on every topic where you don't have a horse in a race. Gear 2, thinking like a sports fan. You still want the truth. You'd accept it if it backed over you. But somewhere in there, you started rooting. And the tell is your skepticism filter, because it doesn't run at one setting anymore. A study lands that supports your side. Solid work, share it. A study lands against you, and suddenly you're methodologist, sample size. Who funded this? Urban has a name for what's happening. Reasoning while motivated, the thinking equivalent of drunk driving. You can still get where you're going, but you're weaving and you feel more sober than you are. Listen to yourself the next time an argument you agree with wins one online. There's a decent chance the word in your head is we won. You put a jersey on an idea, and now its victories are yours, which means its defeats are too. And here's the quiet cost. The sports fan learns less than the scientist and walks away more confident because confirmation is a feeling and feelings compound. This gear can still change its mind. It just hurts now, and that hurt is the first toll booth on the way down. Because below this gear, there's a border, and Urban gives the far side a name, unconvincible land. You cross it the moment the desire to be right loses, quietly, to the desire to feel right. And there's exactly one honest test for which side you're standing on. Is there any evidence, any that would change your mind? If you can describe it, you're still upstairs. If the answer is no, then somewhere along the way you stopped holding the belief, and it started holding you. Gear 3, thinking like an attorney. The attorney doesn't start at a question and travel toward an answer. The attorney starts at the verdict. The client is innocent. Now build the case, and every fact gets hired or fired based on whether it serves. In a real courtroom, that's an honest job because the other side gets to make its case too. Inside one head, there is no other side. It's a courtroom where the ruling came down before the trial started, and all that research energy, and it is energy. The attorney works hard, goes into making the verdict look inevitable. You have argued with this person, fluent, endlessly supplied with citations, and absolutely nothing you said. Nothing that anyone could ever say was going to produce the sentence. That's a good point. Arguing with them felt like billing hours against a brick wall. Hold that memory. This episode is going to need it in a minute. Gear 4, thinking like a zealot. Urban's comparison is the one I can't shake. For the zealot, a sacred belief isn't a case to argue anymore. It's their baby, and nobody researches whether their baby is lovable. Question a zealot's idea and you haven't made a point, you've insulted their child. The response isn't a counter argument, it's a wound. Here's the cruelest mechanic in the whole book. A clear mind looks out at a foggy world, complicated, uncertain, hard. A foggy mind looks out at a perfectly clear one. Total certainty isn't the reward for finishing the thinking. Most of the time, it's the evidence that the thinking never happened. So here's the test, and it's cheaper than any quiz. Pick a belief you'd say defines you. Now, remember the last time somebody went after it, not rudely, just directly. What does that feel like? If the answer is curiosity, or even a flash of irritation followed by actual thought, you hold that belief. If the answer is something closer to trespass, heat in the chest, the sense that you were just attacked, not an idea, then be careful. That's not what believing feels like. That's what belonging feels like. And I want to close the one exit everybody reaches for right now, which is fine, but I'm smart. Intelligence is not the way out. Adam Grant reports research showing the opposite. The higher people scored on reasoning tests, the worse they did at evaluating evidence that cut against their own side, and it went wrong in both political directions. Smart just means the attorney you hire is better. Your IQ is the engine. It has never once decided who's driving, which is the scary part of the whole framework, so let me say it plainly. From the inside, low-rung thinking does not feel low-rung. It feels rigorous. The conviction feels earned because your mind really did do work. Hours of it, gathering, building. It just did all of it downhill from a conclusion it never intended to move. The fog's first job is hiding the fog. And the stakes are bigger than winning or losing arguments. Urban's image for it: on the high rungs, your mind is a permeable filter. Experience passes through and some of it sticks, so you're a little wiser every year. Down below, your mind hardens into a shell that experience bounces off of. 10 more years of living, and on your protected topics, you'll have learned nothing at all. You'll just have 10 more years of citations for the thing you already believed at the start. I tried the test on myself this week. Made an actual list, topics where I could tell you right now what evidence would change my mind. That column filled up fast, and I noticed how good filling it felt. And then noticed that even this framework, the one I'm teaching you, was busy making me feel like the scientist in the room. Sorting other people onto rungs is the most comfortable seat in the house. It is also nearly always the attorney's seat. So don't ask the question your mind is itching to ask right now. Am I a high-rung thinker? Because that answer will arrive instantly with total confidence, and the speed is the giveaway. Ask the harder one. Which topics turn me into an attorney? Not whether, which everyone owns a few. You already know one of yours because you felt something tighten when I said that. Stay with that tightening 1 second longer than you want to. That flinch is the most useful data you'll get from this entire video. One more thing, and it's where we go next. Everything I just described, I described as if it happens inside one skull. It doesn't. You do almost none of your thinking alone. Put you in one room and gear one comes easy. Put the same you in a different room and you'll be defending verdicts by dinner. The gears, it turns out, are contagious. Next time, how 10 smart people, none of them fools, can walk into a room together and become one idiot. In 1951, at a college in Pennsylvania, a psychologist named Solomon Asch sat 8 young men around a table and showed them 2 cards. On the first card, 1 line. On the second card, 3 lines, and the job was to say which of the 3 matched the first, out loud, 1 man at a time around the table. It was not a hard job. The lines were different enough that, tested alone, people got it wrong less than 1% of the time. This was a vision test the way tying your shoes is an obstacle course. Except 7 of the 8 men were actors. And on 12 of the 18 rounds, all 7 calmly, one after another, gave the same wrong answer. The real subject sat there, usually seventh in line, watching something impossible happen. A room full of ordinary, sane people looking at a short line and calling it the long one. And then it was his turn, where this is going, but the numbers are still worth sitting with. About a third of the answers the real subjects gave went with the group, against their own eyes. 3 out of 4 went along at least once. And afterward, in the interviews, most of them said the same thing. They knew the group was wrong. They said it anyway. Here's the part that should keep you up tonight. Ash wasn't testing their eyesight, and he wasn't really testing them. He was testing the room. Change one thing about the room. We'll get there, and the whole effect collapses. Your intelligence has a setting you almost never think about. It's called, who else is here? Last episode, we found the 4 gears in your head, and the uncomfortable fact that the topic decides which gear you're in. This episode is about the other thing that decides. Because you do almost none of your thinking in an empty room, and every room you enter has rules nobody wrote down. Tim Urban calls those rules a group's intellectual culture, and he sorts the rooms into 2 kinds. Not by what they believe. That's the trap. And I want to close it now. This has nothing to do with which opinions a room holds. 2 rooms can hold identical beliefs and be opposite kinds of room. The sorting question is what the room does with disagreement. In one kind, Urban calls it an ideal lab. Disagreeing is a contribution. In the other, you already know this one, the echo chamber. Disagreeing is a betrayal. And the same 10 people can be either. That's the whole hinge of this episode. Nobody is hired into an echo chamber. Room's tip. Here's an idea lab from the inside. Somebody says, I don't know. And the room's respect for them goes up. Because around here, unearned confidence is the embarrassing thing. Conviction gets spent like money. Rarely. And it means something because the person spending it says, I don't know, the rest of the time. Arguments are almost a sport. You can watch 2 people go at an idea hard for 20 minutes and then get lunch because the room runs on one load-bearing assumption. The idea and the person are separate objects. Kicking one is not kicking the other. Now the echo chamber. Same table, same coffee. But here, certain ideas are not experiments, they're sacred. Conviction is the currency now. The more total your certainty, the smarter and the more loyal you sound. I don't know, reads as weakness. Changing your mind reads as flakiness. And because the room has welded ideas to the people holding them, disagreement stops being exploration and becomes rudeness. A challenge to the belief is an attack on the believer. So the room develops a legal system. Not written law. Taboo. Say the wrong thing and the fines are status. The jail is being quietly left out. And the death penalty is exile. Everyone knows the terror schedule by heart, which is why almost nobody ever has to be punished. The sentence gets served in advance in all the things that never get said. One more thing, and it's the one people miss. An echo chamber doesn't need a tyrant or a cult or a cause. Urban points out it can be 2 people. If one half of a couple has learned over the years that challenging the other's strong opinions is never worth the evening it costs. That marriage is an echo chamber with a population of 2. Somebody's ruling it, and neither of them ever decided that. Why does any of this matter beyond office politics? Because of what a room full of talking people actually is. A single neuron is nearly useless. 86 billion of them, connected, are a mind. Urban's point, and he's borrowing from real science here, is that the same trick repeats 1 floor up. Individual brains, connected by conversation, form a larger thinking system. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt puts it plainly in The Righteous Mind. If you arrange people so that some can use their reasoning to knock down the claims of others, the group produces good reasoning as an emergent property. The catch is in the arrangement. Arrange them as an idea lab and something remarkable happens. Every person's biases point in a different direction, so they cancel. My blind spot is covered by your working eye. One member finds the flaw, and because changing your mind is cheap here, the whole system drops the error at the speed of conversation. The group becomes smarter than its smartest member. Urban calls this a genie. Arrange the same people as an echo chamber, and the machine runs in reverse. Now the biases are aligned, all pulling the same way, and they don't cancel. They compound. The doubts, which still exist inside every skull at that table, stay locked in the skulls because the tariff schedule says so. The group certainty goes up as its accuracy goes down. And you get Urban's other creature, a golem, a giant that is more confident than any member, dumber than the average of them, and completely unable to notice either fact. That's the answer to this episode's title. 10 smart people don't become one idiot by getting dumber. They become one idiot by connecting wrong. Urban tells a fable about this. A kingdom, a new insecure king, a decree from the palace steps. Mock the king's mustache and you die. A few citizens object. The king orders his guards to hang them. And here's the moment the whole book turns on. Every guard, privately, is against it. If they simply stood still, all of them together, the order would evaporate, because a king's power is exactly as real as the obedience in front of him. Each guard knows this. Each guard also knows what happens to the first one to refuse if the others don't follow. The silence stretches, and then one junior guard, terrified of being suspected, shouts, "Hang the traitors," and the rest join in, relieved. An hour later, 5 people are dead, executed by a room in which almost no one wanted them executed. That's the mechanism under the fable, and Urban gives it names. Your inner self is what you think. Your outer self is what you say. A room can't read inner selves. It runs entirely on outer selves. So when the cost of honest speech goes high enough, everyone's outer self starts lying in the same direction. And every person in the room becomes a minority of one who believes wrongly that they're alone. The room now holds an official opinion that almost nobody in it actually holds. Nobody's mind was changed. Every mind was just ... quarantined. Which is why the most important number in the Ash experiment isn't the third who caved. It's what happened in the variation. Ash planted one actor who told the truth, one voice before the subject's turn, saying the obviously right answer. Conformity collapsed. Wrong answers fell to a quarter of what they'd been. One honest voice didn't have to convince anyone of anything. It just proved the fence was imaginary. And when that one ally switched sides mid-experiment, the subjects folded again, almost immediately. That's how much of your independence is on loan from the room, and how much one person saying one true sentence can hand back to everyone listening. So now do the thing you've been doing all episode anyway, and think about your rooms, the group chat, the workplace channel, the table where your family eats. Here's the trap in that exercise, and I want you to notice you're already in it. When I said echo chamber, a room came to mind and cast you as the honest guard, the one dissenter, the hero of the fable. Everyone casts themselves there. The census of echo chambers, taken from the inside, is always 0. So run the colder audit. In which of your rooms does your outer self routinely say things or leave things unsaid that your inner self doesn't sign off on? You know, the tariff schedule of every room you live in. You learned it the way you learn a staircase in the dark. And then the harder question, the one I had to sit with this week. What am I doing to the tariff? Because I found one of my rooms where nobody argued with me in years, and I've been telling myself that's because I'm right a lot. It isn't. It's because somewhere along the way I made disagreeing with me expensive. One eye roll at a time. And the people who love me quietly stopped paying. No one got hanged. That's what a mustache court looks like when it's yours. The room makes the mind. But you, right now, are somebody else's room. Because rooms scale, a company is a room. A movement is a room. A country is a room with a flag on it. And every one of them runs on the same physics you just watched. Outer selves, tariff schedules, and the occasional junior guard shouting first. Which raises a strange question. If echo chambers are what our instincts build by default, why isn't everything one? It turns out that a few centuries ago, some people invented a trick for keeping rooms open, a machine for forcing golems to behave like genies. It's the weirdest invention in history. It feels awful to use, and it's the only reason a sentence has never gotten you hanged. Next time, what the trick is and why every generation gets tempted to switch it off. Just before dawn on July 11th, 1804, two rowboats crossed the Hudson River, separately to a ledge below the cliffs at Weehawken, New Jersey. In one boat sat the Vice President of the United States. In the other, the man who had built the country's financial system and written most of the essays that talked the skeptical public into ratifying its constitution. Two of the most educated men in the Western world, then. Products of the Enlightenment, lawyers both, men whose entire careers were made of words. And the dispute between them was also made of words. A letter in an Albany newspaper reporting that at a dinner party, Alexander Hamilton had despicable opinion of Aaron Burr. That was the wound. A second-hand sentence about a dinner party. The technology available to them for resolving it was this: stand a few paces apart at sunrise and fire pistols at each other. Burr's ball caught Hamilton above the hip. He died the next afternoon. And here's the thing you have to resist, watching this from the last page of the history book, the urge to call it madness. It wasn't madness. It was etiquette, a formal, rule-bound, socially respected system for settling disagreements between gentlemen, and versions of it had governed disputes for most of human history. The strange event isn't the duel. The strange event is what came after. The arrangement you live inside right now, so completely that you've never once noticed how bizarre it is. Two people who despise each other, saying words at volume, and both going home alive. That arrangement has a design. Somebody built it, surprisingly recently. And it is much, much weirder than the pistols. Tim Urban calls the operating system that ran all of that. The duel and nearly everything before it. The power games have one rule, and you already know it, because every animal on Earth is born knowing it. Everyone can do whatever they want, if they have the power to do so. The bear can eat the rabbit if it can catch it. That's the whole rule book. There's no referee to appeal to, no such thing as unfair. There's only stronger and weaker. And the entire sweep of recorded history is mostly that rule playing out at scale. Golems fighting golems, with the biggest, meanest golem running things until a bigger one showed up. And before we get superior about it, remember what the last episode taught us, because it lands hard here. Golem mode wasn't stupidity. For thousands of years, it was the correct answer. Because if your neighbors have formed a giant and you haven't, you're finished. Urban calls it the catch-22 of our species. The biggest threat to humanity has always been low-rung humanity. And low-rung humanity persisted because it was the best available defense against exactly that threat. Your instincts were tuned by that arms race. Every one of us ships from the factory ready to play the power games at a moment's notice, which is what makes the next part so unlikely. A few hundred years ago, the last page and a half of the 1,000-page book, a group of thinkers proposed editing the rule, not abolishing self-interest. They were far too realistic for that, just changing the ending. Everyone can do whatever they want, that part stays, as long as it doesn't harm anyone else. Urban calls the system built on the edited rule the liberal games, and the old aphorism states its whole logic in one line. Your right to swing your arms ends where the other person's nose begins. Look at what the edit actually asks you, because it's a strange bargain. You surrender the freedom to oppress, and in exchange you get freedom from oppression. You hand in the cudgel, and the deal is that everyone else hands in theirs. And once the cudgel is off the table, something remarkable happens to ambition. It doesn't die, it reroutes. If I can't take what you have, I have to offer you something you want more. If I can't seize power, I have to convince you to vote it to me. If I can't silence the man I despise, I am left with exactly one weapon. I have to out-argue him in public where everyone can watch me try. The founders who wrote that bargain into a constitution knew the launch was compromised, the full set of rights applied. At first, To white men, and the country has been fighting over the gap between the promise and the practice ever since. Urban's point and ours isn't that the machine arrived perfect. It's that the machine was the first one ever built that contained the tools for its own repair. And the strangest market the rewrite created wasn't the one for goods. It was the one for ideas. Free speech is the rule that says beliefs compete the way products do. Anyone can sell. Nobody can be forced to buy. And bad ideas go bankrupt in public instead of ruling in private. Here's what that machine can do. The writer Jonathan Roch describes what it meant to be gay in America in 1960. Barred from government work, hunted by police for sport, condemned as evil by the church, sick by the doctors, criminal by the law, and rejected at the most vulnerable age by your own parents. A minority that's small, hated that thoroughly, has never once in the power games had a move. No golem that tiny wins a fight. But the liberal games had installed a different weapon, and Roch names it. In ones and twos, then in streams, then in cascades, gay people talked. They argued, they explained, they showed up and let the old claims meet actual lives. And under open argument, the claims did what false inventory does in a market. They collapsed. Within 2 generations, the country changed its mind, not because anyone seized a palace, but because a conversation was legal and couldn't be stopped. That is the trick's whole boast. It hands the powerless, the one lever that has ever reliably beaten power without becoming it. So if the trick is this good, why does every generation, including yours, itch to switch it off? Because the trick is unnatural and your body knows it. Your instincts are native speakers of the power games. The liberal games are a second language learned late, spoken with an accent, and under stress you revert. When an idea you hold sacred gets attacked in the open market, remember the test from episode 2. Your threat system doesn't register commerce, it registers harm. And when the system asks you to defend the speech of someone whose views disgust you, it isn't asking for tolerance. It's asking you to protect the porch light your instincts most want smashed. Of course it feels wrong. It felt wrong to everyone who ever kept the bargain, which is precisely why the bargain keeps needing to be kept on purpose. There's a second thing the trick can't do, and last episode already showed it to you. The law can stop the government from punishing your speech. It cannot stop a room from punishing it. Urban's phrase for the American arrangement is that you're so free, you're free to be unfree, free to build echo chambers inside the open society, little kingdoms with tariff schedules where the First Amendment holds perfectly and nobody says what they think anyway. A country can have flawless speech laws and still fall silent, one room at a time, because the mustache court doesn't need a statute. It just needs the people in the room. And here's the fragile part. Roch points out that the written constitution is just words on paper. The real system is a dense web of unwritten rules. Norms about listening, about not punishing honest error, about answering speech with speech. Urban's image is masonry. The laws are the bricks, but the norms are the mortar. Nobody can repeal the mortar. It just crumbles one dinner table and one comment section at a time whenever enough people decide that this opponent, this once, deserves the cudgel instead of an argument. The trick has no enforcement mechanism deeper than the people inside it. It is load-bearing etiquette, exactly as binding as the duel was, and exactly as abandonable. Now, the test, and it isn't whether you believe in free speech, because everyone says yes to that. The test is a specific face. You're the one. The public voice that makes your jaw set, the one whose every sentence lands on you as this is different. This isn't speech. This is damage. Notice the shape of that feeling. It doesn't arrive as hatred. It arrives as clarity, a calm moral certainty that the line obviously falls just past your opinions and just short of theirs. I'll go first. I have a mute button I press tomorrow. For a voice I could name, and I can produce excellent reasons. I've noticed the reasons show up about half a second after the wish. Briefcases in hand, like the attorney from episode 2 reporting for work. That feeling of clarity is the oldest feeling there is. Every censor in history had it. Not one of them experienced themselves as the villain. Every single one experienced themselves as the person finally drawing a reasonable line. The trick, the whole unnatural, magnificent trick, comes down to this. It only exists if it protects speech that feels like harm to someone. And the someone is counting on today is you. So we have the trick. It's written down, it's lawyered, it's 2.5 centuries old. And yet, look around. The arguing that was supposed to make us smarter is making us dumber. Both markets are still open, but something's gone strange in the one for ideas. Here's a clue about what. In 1988, in a first grade classroom, a teacher held a mock election and counted votes out of a shoebox. And the result was 20-1. 6-year-olds, not one of them knew a single policy. Every one of them knew which side was the good guys. Where does that knowledge come from? And what happens to a country where politics stops being a set of opinions and becomes the answer to who are you? Next time, welcome to Political Disney World. In November 1988, in a first grade classroom in Newton, Massachusetts, a teacher held a presidential election. Each 6-year-old circled a name on a slip of paper, Michael Dukakis or George Bush, folded it, and dropped it in a shoebox on her desk. At the end of the day, she counted the votes and announced the result. Dukakis 20, Bush 1. One of those 20 was Tim Urban, and decades later, he opened a chapter of his book with that shoebox because of what it proves. Not one child in that room could have named a policy. None of them knew what a tax was, or a treaty, or a trade deficit. And yet 20 out of 21 already knew the way you know which end of the pool is deep, which candidate was the nice good guy, and which was the mean bad guy. As Urban tells it, that certainty arrived years before any information did. The information, when it finally showed up, would be hired to explain a verdict rendered in first grade. So here's the question this episode turns on. Where does a 6-year-old's politics come from? Because wherever that is, that's where most of yours came from too. Let's get one thing out of the way because this episode is not an argument for centrism, and neither is Urban's book. Take the axis we built in episode 2, how you think, not what you think, and lay it over politics. Up on the high rungs, political disagreement isn't a malfunction. It's the machine working. People fight over what's actually true, over what a fair country would look like, over how to get there from here. And the fights are fierce because the questions are hard and nobody has the answer sheet. Even the two teams make sense up there. In Urban's telling, progressivism and conservatism aren't identities. They're functions. One is the gas pedal. No country improves without change. The other is the brakes. Most new ideas are bad and somebody has to say so. A driver needs both feet. Each side sees exactly the blind spots the other can't, which means a country thinks best when they're the same trick from episode 3, scaled up to a nation, a diversity of biases, canceling. So if you've ever wondered how someone reasonable could possibly vote the other way, that's the answer. On the high rungs, they're your counterweight, not your enemy. The disease isn't disagreement. The disease is what happened to it. But there's a bigger world of politics below the high rungs, and Urban gives it the name this episode wears, Political Disney World. A Disney movie runs on binary code, pure good and pure evil, ones and zeros, and even the weather takes sides. Which is exactly right for its audience, because its audience is children who need to learn good versus bad before they can handle complicated. The trouble starts when adults process the actual world that way. The real world is gray all the way down. Real people are microcosms of it. Everyone a mixed bag. Political Disney World deletes the gray. Good politicians and bad ones. Good policies and bad ones. Good election results and stolen ones. And each kingdom comes with a story. In the Blue Kingdom's story, as Urban tells it, righteous citizens struggle to carry the country toward progress, while bigots try to drag it backward into a land run by corporations and cruelty. In the Red Kingdom's story, honest, hard-working families hold the country together. while elitists and their handout armies pull it down into decadence and tyranny. Notice the engineering. The two stories are incompatible in every detail and identical in structure. Each casts its own team as the protagonist, the other as the villain, and the viewer, you as a hero, just for showing up. No story that flattering is ever free. The kingdoms even have their own ecology of ideas. Up on the high rungs, conspiracy theories get processed. The false ones die under scrutiny, and the true ones, the scandals that turn out to be real, work their way into the record. Political Disney World has no such filter, only the narrative test. Does the theory make the bad guys look bad? Then it lives, which is why, as Urban points out, so many long disproven theories never seem to die. They did die years ago up on the high rungs. They live on down below, where nothing that flatters the story can be killed. Here's the test that tells you which world someone's politics lives in, and it's not which side they're on. Watch what happens when their team and their principles collide. When the other side suppresses speech or abuses power or torches a norm, everyone's outraged. That costs nothing. The reveal comes when your own side does the same thing. On the high rungs, the principle holds and the team takes the criticism. In political Disney World, the principle quietly reverses itself. And if you look at the last few decades of American arguments about executive power or deficits or protests or presidential character, you can watch entire crowds swap scripts with each other the moment the White House changes hands, each reciting, word for word, what the other crowd was saying 4 years earlier. It wasn't always like this. And the way it changed is a machine worth watching because nobody's hands are on the levers. Go back to the middle of the 20th century, and America's two parties were ideologically scrambled, each one a roomy, contradictory coalition, full of people who'd fight their own side as readily as the other. Division was everywhere, but it was distributed, spread across factions and regions in a world war's worth of foreign enemies. Then, over a generation, the scramble sorted. The civil rights era forced both parties to decide who they were. Conservative Democrats and progressive Republicans gradually traded places. And each party, unwilling to loudly disown its own hardest line faction, slowly became the place for people who feared the other party's hardliners. Two roomy coalitions purified into two ideological teams. Then the sorting went cultural, and this is where it gets personal. Here's a result from a famous 1971 model of segregation. You don't need bigots to produce total separation. Run the simulation with people who are perfectly happy with diversity and have just one small preference, not to be badly outnumbered by neighbors unlike them. And the map still ends up fully segregated, small individual bias, large collective bias. Now, give the two parties cultural uniforms. Urban's honest generalization list runs from Whole Foods to Cracker Barrel, from the Times to Fox, avocado toast to NASCAR, and every ordinary, innocent choice to live near people like us quietly doubles as a political relocation. By one much argued measure, the share of Americans living in landslide counties where one party wins by 20 points or more went from about a quarter of the country in 1976 to nearly 6 in 10 by 2020. And homogeneous rooms don't just agree. Episode 3 told you what they do. In 2007, researchers sat citizens of Boulder, a liberal city, and Colorado Springs, a conservative one, in small groups with their own neighbors to discuss 3 hot issues. Nobody was arguing with the other side. There was no other side in the room. After mere hours of talking with people who already agreed with them, the liberals had moved left, the conservatives had moved right, and the gap between the cities had widened. The rooms did what rooms do. Now the room is the county. And here's the strangest fact in the whole research literature. One Urban is careful to flag. Americans' actual opinions haven't drifted to the extremes nearly as much as you'd think. On the issues themselves, the center is still crowded. What's exploded is something else. The researchers call it effective polarization, not how far apart we are, but how much we dislike each other across the line. We didn't become a country of extremists. We became a country of enemies with moderate views. Here's the number that proves it. In 1960, researchers asked American parents how they'd feel if their child married someone from the other party. About 4% of Democrats and 5% of Republicans said they'd be displeased. It barely registered as a question, like asking how they'd feel about a son-in-law who preferred a different car company. In 2019, the same question found 45% of Democrats and 35% of Republicans unhappy at the thought. In 2 generations, party went from a preference to a bloodline, from something you held to something you are. Episode 2 gave you the words for that. So run the test on yourself. It takes 10 seconds. Pick your position on any one political issue. Now, ask, could a stranger who knows that single fact predict your positions on abortion, guns, climate, immigration, and taxes? Be honest, could they run the whole checklist? Because those issues have almost nothing to do with each other. There's no logical thread connecting a view on marginal tax rates to a view on gun policy to a view on climate modeling. If your answers line up anyway, all of them on one team's list, then at least some of those conclusions were not conclusions. They came with the uniform, the way mine did. I can tell you exactly what my zip code, my coffee, and my podcast queue predict about my ballot, and the honest answer to how much of my politics did I reason my way into. Embarrassed me when I finally did the math on it. 20-1. And I was 6. A sorted country is a stable formation. In its way, 2 kingdoms, 2 stories, everyone in uniform. But formations like that have a vulnerability. When an audience is that loyal, that predictable, that afraid of the other gate, it stops being a public and becomes a market. And markets get served. Next time, what happens when politicians, primaries, and a brand new kind of media all discover one incentive at a time, with nobody deciding it and everyone responding rationally, that this market pays better for war than for governing? It's the story the book calls the downward spiral. And fair warning, because the season owes you this, watching it happen to one party will feel, if you're on the other team, wonderful. That feeling is the subject of this whole series. In 1990, Republican candidates for office around the country received a mailing from a political action committee in Washington. It was a memo about words titled, "With no embarrassment at all," language, a key mechanism of control. Candidates, it explained, kept asking how they could learn to talk like the committee's famous chairman, a Georgia congressman named Newt Gingrich. So here, in writing, was the method. 2 lists. The first list held words to attach to yourself and your ideas. Freedom, truth, family, prosperity, common sense. The second list, contrasting words, the memo called them, was for describing your opponent. Decay, pathetic, radical, sick, betrayers. Read that second list again, slowly, and notice what it isn't. It isn't an argument. There's no policy in it, no claim you could check. It's a mood, prefabricated, packaged, mailed in bulk, a vocabulary kit for turning an opponent into an enemy. Now, here's how this episode is going to be different from what you're expecting. We are not going to spend it deciding whether the man behind that memo was a bad person. We're going to ask a colder and much scarier question. What kind of machine makes that memo a winning move? Because in the world we've spent 5 episodes building, sorted counties, uniformed voters, rooms that punish dissent, winning moves get copied. First, the honesty you wrote about what this episode is. It's a case study of one party, the Republican Party, over 60 years. That's the book's choice, and Urban is upfront about his own seat in the theater. Is the kid from the blue shoebox, a lifelong Democrat who says 6 years of research left his old views not exactly wrong, but not exactly right. And it's our choice too, with a promise attached. The machinery you're about to see has no party registration. And over the next episodes, we'll watch the same X-ray pass over movements the other coalition owns. If at any point tonight you feel the warm glow of being on the correct team, hold that thought until the end. It's load-bearing. Because here's the frame that makes the whole story make sense. A political party isn't a creature with one mind. It's a coalition of factions, and episode 2 scaled up. Every party contains high-rung factions and low-rung ones. In 1964, a Republican think tank published an open letter drawing exactly this line inside its own party. The moderate, it said, accepts a complicated world with no total solutions. The extremist divides reality into two antithetical halves, good men and evil ones. Notice, that's not a left-right distinction. It's a rung distinction written by Republicans about Republicans in defense of their party's own high rungs. Every party has both. The story of the next 60 years is the story of which factions' tactics kept getting paid. Rewind to the early 60s, when the party's hardest line faction was a genuine underdog, passionate, organized, and rejected by most of the country and most of its own party. The liberal games, remember, offer an underdog two legal moves: persuade the country toward you or compromise yourself toward the country. Both are slow and expensive, and neither comes with a guarantee. But episode 4 warned you about the third option. Stop playing the game and start playing the rules. In 1963, at the Young Republicans National Convention, the faction's operatives ran a maneuver that historian Jeffrey Cabasiris reconstructed in detail. They held the chair hostage for 22 straight hours with an unending siege of procedural objections, filled the hall with noise until business was impossible, and ground the convention down until exhausted delegates went home, at which point the count that remained went their way. They may well have lost the actual vote. The chaos made a true count impossible, which was the point. While their opponents were trying to win the boxing match, they quietly won the referee. Hold on to the shape of that, because it's the episode's master pattern. When everyone else is bound by unwritten rules, the first mover who breaks them collects a prize, and the rule never grows back. The move costs almost nothing. It won an organization, and everyone watching learned something. Meanwhile, the environment was changing, and remember the season's one law: change the environment, and the same human nature produces new behavior. For decades, an FCC rule called the Fairness Doctrine had required broadcasters to air controversial issues with contrasting viewpoints. In 1987, it was repealed. The next year, a talk radio host named Rush Limbaugh went national, and by the early 90s, he was one of the country's most prominent syndicated political voices. In 1996, Fox News and MSNBC launched within months of each other. The old networks had broadcast one signal for everyone, which made neutrality a business asset. The new outlets could narrowcast, pick a tribe, and serve it. And episode 2 gave you the vocabulary for what that does. A broadcaster is paid to think like a scientist. A narrowcaster is paid to think like an attorney. Nobody, any of these companies, had to be a villain. The rational response to the new market was confirmation, conflict, and a good clean enemy. Political junk food. Engineered for the primitive mind the way Skittles are. Now mesh that gear with the one from the last episode. As the county sorted into landslides, most seats stopped being competitive in November. The real election moved to the primary. And a primary electorate is small, loyal, and drawn from the most committed end of the party, marinating in that same narrow caste media. So walk a mile in an office holder's shoes. Any office holder. The middle of the country can't fire you anymore. You're flanking. Every incentive you face, every donor call, every primary poll, every clip that does numbers now points one direction. Never let anyone stand between you and the enemy. That's the ratchet. Each escalation is individually rational. De-escalation is individually suicidal. And the memo from the cold open stops looking like an aberration and starts looking like what it was: a user's manual for the machine, everyone was already inside. By the Obama years, the machine was mature, and you can hear it speaking through its operators. In 2010, the Senate's Republican leader told a reporter that the single most important thing his caucus wanted to achieve was for the president to be a one-term president. And in the same interview, that he was willing to meet that president halfway where their goals aligned. Both sentences were surely sincere. Only one of them was survivable inside the machine, and it wasn't the second one. A year later, after a standoff that took the nation's credit rating to the brink, the same leader observed that the fight had created an entirely new template, that raising the debt ceiling would never again be routine. Notice the grammar of that sentence. Not a boast, not a confession, a weather report. He was describing the ratchet clicking accurately from inside it. And in 2016, the machine administered its final exam to its own architects. A primary field of senators and governors denounced the eventual nominee in extraordinarily harsh terms, on the record, on camera, as a warning about their own party's future. Within months, many of those same figures had endorsed him. You can call that cowardice, and the internet did. But watch it as machinery, and it's more chilling than cowardice. The ones who came around ran the same calculation, got the same answer, and obeyed it because the machine had spent 40 years arranging things so that the base was the market, and the market had made its choice, and no politician survives his market. That's what the spiral means. It doesn't need anyone to turn the crank. The crank turns them. Now the clause this episode is not allowed to end without. Every component you just watched, narrowcast economics, junk food, headlines, primary fear, the loyalty test, is a machine part. And machine parts don't check your registration. The same years that built conservative talk radio built a booming blue audience genre, often organized around look how awful the other tribe is, played for laughs. An attorney with better jokes is still an attorney. The study from last episode that made conservatives more extreme in Colorado Springs made liberals more extreme in Boulder the same afternoon by the same mechanism. And the book is blunt about the other thing the comfortable version of this story leaves out. The voters inside the spiral had real grievances. Districts with collapsing incomes and shuttered main streets. People lectured at by a coastal culture that plainly disdained them, served by institutions that had earned their distrust. The machine didn't invent that pain. It monetized it, the way a machine on the other side monetizes yours. So if this episode felt good, and if you're on one team, it did, I built it. I know exactly which beats purred. Then you just felt the product working from the inside. The junk food tastes like information. That's the recipe. I'll go last, like always. Every draft of this episode wanted to be a villain story. I felt the pull in my own hands, cut the halfway caveat from the interview quote, and the leader becomes a cartoon. Keep the insults from 2016 verbatim, and the endorsements play as pure farce. Drop the paragraph about the base's real grievances, and everyone watching from Blue America goes to bed delighted. Each of those cuts would have made a better show. Which means I spent this week inside the exact machine I was describing, feeling the exact incentives. And the only difference between me and a cable producer is which market I'm afraid of. You're my primary, and don't think I don't know it. Nobody decided to break it. That's the sentence this episode exists to earn. The politicians responded to the voters. The media responded to the ratings. The voters responded to the media. And every single link in that circle was a human being doing the locally reasonable thing, including the ones watching, including this one. And now the promise from the top of the episode comes due. The machinery you just watched climb through one party has a mirror image. Same rungs, same third option, climbing through movements on the other side of the street. Movements with causes so plainly just that questioning their methods feels like attacking their goals. Which is exactly the armor this kind of machine wears best. Next time, two movements that share every slogan and disagree about everything underneath. And the one question that tells them apart. Picture two people at the same march, carrying the same sign, chanting the same chant. They believe, as far as anyone can see, as far as they can see, the same thing. Now imagine sitting each one down afterward and asking one quiet question. What would change your mind? The first marcher pauses, actually thinks about it, maybe for the first time, and then answers with something specific, a number, a study, an argument they'd have to take seriously. If the policy I marched for makes the people I marched for worse off, show me that, and I'll march differently. The question doesn't threaten this marcher. It almost seems to interest them. The second marcher hears the same 6 words and something closes. Not anger exactly. More like the look you'd give someone who asked politely, what would make you renounce your family? The question itself is the offense. Why would anyone want their mind changed about this, unless they were secretly on the other side? Same sign, same march, same vocabulary, all the way down. Justice, equality, dignity. And underneath the vocabulary, 2 operating systems so different that by the end of this episode, you'll wonder how we ever thought one word could cover them both. This is the seasoned machinery in the place it's hardest to look at, not in a party you can safely despise from a distance, but inside causes. And if you're watching this, some of these are your causes that are in themselves. Just start with the version of the story that's written in pen. A country founded on a sentence, all men are created equal, and a set of promises, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, equal standing under the law. Urban's image is that alongside that pen, some of the founders kept a second instrument, invisible ink for the asterisk. Accept the enslaved, accept women, accept whoever it was locally convenient to accept. Not a flaw in the promises. A betrayal of them by people powerful enough to betray quietly. Martin Luther King stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 and made exactly this argument. The founding documents were a promissory note, he said, and America had defaulted on it, handed its black citizens a check marked insufficient funds. Listen to the structure of that. It's not a rejection of the promise. It's a demand that the promise be kept, the country indicted by its own founding sentence. And a century before him, Frederick Douglass had given the movement its physics. Find out what a people will quietly submit to. And you found the exact measure of injustice that will be imposed on them. This is what Urban calls liberal social justice. And the American 20th century is its trophy case. Suffrage, civil rights, second-wave feminism, gay rights. Movements that fought against real violence at real cost, using the machine from episode 4. Speech, press, assembly, courts, votes. Underdogs who took the liberal game's first legal option, persuasion, and ran mind-changing cascades through a country that had every power advantage over them, and won. If the season has heroes, they're in this beat, but there has always been a second diagnosis available, older than this decade, with deep academic roots. It says the invisible ink isn't the scandal, the pen is the founding ideals themselves, the neutral-sounding rules, the free markets, the free speech, are how power dresses itself. The promises weren't betrayed. They were designed to produce winners and losers. On this reading, fixing level 3 of the pyramid is rearranging furniture. The foundation has to go. Here's the honest version of where one of its central ideas came from, because the origin deserves respect. In 1989, a law professor named Kimberly Crenshaw published a paper about a case in which black women had sued General Motors, arguing that the company's practices had left black women almost entirely out of the workforce and then exposed those recently hired to layoffs. The court split the case into separate boxes. Race discrimination over here, sex discrimination over there, but no combined claim for black women as black women. The discrimination fell between the categories, where the law couldn't see it. Crenshaw named the blind spot intersectionality. As a legal lens, it was a real insight about a real injustice. And Urban argues it didn't stay a lens. Scaled up and fused with a view of society as fundamentally a power struggle, it became something much bigger. a ranking of all identity groups into a single hierarchy of advantage, and a theory in which that hierarchy explains nearly everything, every institution, every disparity. One axis, promoted from a truth to the truth. Urban's name for the movement built on that promotion is social justice fundamentalism. And the word doing the work in that name is not social justice. It's fundamentalism. Hold that thought. It's the hinge of the episode. So, two movements, one vocabulary. How do you tell which one you're looking at or which one you're in? The season already gave you the master test, and the cold open ran it. What would change your mind? But Urban's chapter offers two more, and they're sharper. Test 2. What happens to disagreement? In the liberal movement, disagreement is metabolized. It's evidence to be answered, episode 3 style, and answering it well is how the movement stays right. In the fundamentalist mode, disagreement gets diagnosed. The best-known example is from Robin DiAngelo's bestseller, White Fragility, which argues that defensive reactions by white people when their racial worldview is challenged, including argumentation, silence, anger, fear, guilt, and leaving are part of the pattern she calls white fragility. Urban's critique is that this can become a structure in which the accusation is confirmed by acceptance and also treated as confirmed by denial. Whatever you think of any particular diagnosis, notice the shape. A claim that no possible response can falsify isn't functioning as a claim anymore. It's functioning as a test of submission. Test 3. Does the principle survive changing sides? The liberal tradition's remedy for discrimination has been to attack discrimination itself, the Douglas to King line. The fundamentalist remedy is stated plainest by Ibram X. Kendi in a much-quoted passage from his best-selling book. The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. That is his stated position in his words. And its honesty is almost clarifying because it gives you a clean version of the question that divides the two movements. Is the goal to end the weapon or to change who holds it? And Urban notes the same asymmetry episode 2 would predict. Disparities that fit the hierarchy are treated as proof of injustice. Disparities that cut the other way get quietly exempted from the same logic. A rule that only runs in one direction isn't analysis. It's allegiance. Now the clause that keeps this episode from becoming a weapon, and I need you to hear it at full volume. Fundamentalism is not a left-wing invention, and Urban's own vocabulary proves he knows it. The faction that captured the Young Republicans in 1963, the one from last episode, his name for them is the Republican fundamentalists. Same word, same operating system, sacred beliefs that can't be questioned, disagreement processed as betrayal, identity as authority, and a willingness to reach for the third option when persuasion runs slow. The content differs completely. Scripture, nation, market, race, gender, and the mode is identical. Every movement big enough to matter has both engines inside it. A wing that wants to convince you and a wing that wants you to comply, including the movements you love, including whichever cause just flickered through your mind with a small defensive, not mine. Though, and the confusion between the two, cause versus mode, is the most weaponized confusion in American life, in both directions at once. One side's media points a camera at a movement's worst zealot and calls it the whole cause. That's the smear that says the mode is the movement. And the movement's own fundamentalist wing tells its liberal dissenters that criticizing the mode is attacking the cause. That's the smear that keeps the high-rung members quiet, marching next to people they privately disagree with, outer selves in formation. Both smears profit from erasing the same line, which tells you something. The line must matter enormously. Here's what I found when I ran this on myself, and it cost me more than the other episodes did. I have causes, real ones, the kind that decide my vote, and my donations, the kind I'd march for. And when I listed the low-rung behavior inside those causes, the unfalsifiable claims, the diagnosed dissenters, the third option tactics, I noticed I'd been grading it all on a curve. Their hearts are in the right place, I'd been telling myself, and so is mine. But that's exactly the armor from the button of last episode. A cause, so just that questioning its methods feels like attacking its goal. There's no better camouflage the fundamentalist engine can wear than a truly righteous cause, and no defender wants more than a person like me, who would protect the mode out of loyalty to the movement. So, the audit 10 seconds, like always. Take the cause you're most sure of, not the one you argue about, the one that's you. Now that's which marcher you are. And be careful with how quickly the answer comes back, because you already know from episode 2 what instant certainty is evidence of. If the honest answer is, I've never once criticized my own side's methods out loud where it costs me, then the sign in your hands may be right, and it matters which engine is carrying it. Because here's what happens when the fundamentalist engine of any movement meets an institution full of people who privately disagree and publicly complain. Episode 3 showed you the physics in a lab. One voice flips a room. There's a real world version, and it runs in reverse, and it happened at one small college over 1 week in the spring of 2017. A case so contested that we'll spend next episode being as careful with it as anything in this season. Not because the mechanism is unclear, because the mechanism is the clearest thing in the whole story. Next time, how institutions actually fall and why it's never majority that decides. Since the 1970s, a small public college in Olympia, Washington, had held an annual tradition called the Day of Absence, named for a 1965 play in which students and faculty of color voluntarily stayed away from campus for a day to make their contribution visible by its absence. In 2017, the organizers inverted it. This year, white students, staff, and faculty were invited to be the ones who stayed away, attending programming off campus. A biology professor named Brett Weinstein, 15 years at the college, politically left by his own description, and supportive of the earlier voluntary form of the event, wrote an email to the faculty list. A public flashpoint was one email. Its core was a single distinction. There's a difference, he wrote, between a group choosing to absent itself from a shared space and a group being asked to leave it. He said he'd be on campus that day and invited discussion. Here's what the public record says happened within weeks. Student protesters confronted him in and around his classroom, on video, chanting for his resignation. Classes were disrupted. The president's office was occupied. Contemporary reports said campus police told Weinstein he was not safe on his own campus, and he held his biology class off campus. In June, an anonymous caller told the police line he was on his way to the campus with a .44 Magnum, and the college closed for days. 2 weeks later, the right-wing group Patriot Prayer held a rally there, and campus activities were suspended again. And in September, Weinstein and his wife, Heather Haying, also a professor there, resigned as part of a $500,000 settlement. The college admitted no wrongdoing and rejected the claim's allegations. That sentence is part of this story too. And it stays in from one email dispute to all of that in a single quarter of a school year. This episode is about the physics in between. Before the mechanism, the honesty. This story is contested, and most tellings of it, including largely the books, lean on the account of one side. Weinstein has told this version at length. The college disputed his claims all the way through the settlement. The student protesters have their own version, in which the story didn't start with his email at all, but with years of grievances about race on campus that the coverage skipped. This episode is not going to tell you who was right in their hearts, because I can't know that. And neither can the people who are certain. What makes Evergreen worth an episode isn't that it's extreme. It's that it's documented, video, emails, official statements, dated news coverage, which makes it something rare. A laboratory case where we can watch the season's machinery run in public while staying close to the record. And one more reason, which is the season's whole method. A story that's contested is exactly where a framework earns its keep or gets exposed. If the machinery only explains the cases that flatter your side, it isn't machinery. It's a costume. So that's the deal for the next 10 minutes. Mechanism only. And the mechanism, it turns out, doesn't care whose hearts appear. Start with what episode 3 taught you about fences. A rule against speech is a figment until the moment someone tests it and nobody comes to their defense. And then it's electric. Whatever you think of Weinstein's email, watch what the system did with it. One faculty member crossed the line publicly. The question the whole institution then answered, every professor, every administrator, in real time, was the king mustache question. Does anyone stand next to him? Few public defenses reached the record in time to change the room. And from that moment, defense at that college wasn't about him anymore. It was a broadcast to every mind on that campus. This is what testing the fence costs now. And spare a real thought for the students, because the mechanism was running on them hardest of all, and it was not their invention. Picture being 19 inside that information environment. Your entire visible room, classmates, respected professors, the campus's moral vocabulary, pointing one direction, and episode 3 already showed you what a unanimous room does to a person's own eyes. Where everyone around you believes a thing, the believing itself starts to look like evidence. That's not a defect of young people. It's the social proof machinery every one of us runs on, and it works best on the sincere. Many of those students were doing what conviction plus a unanimous room produces in any of us, at any age, on any campus or trading floor or church board in the country. If you're comfortable calling them a mob, notice how comfortable, and remember which episode this is. Second component, remember that room runs on outer selves. How many people at that college privately thought the email had a point? Here's the honest answer. Nobody knows, and that's the mechanism. In a captured institution, private opinion becomes unknowable, even to the people holding it, because no one will pay the price of going first to find out. Episode 3's lab result was that one ally collapses the whole conformity effect. The evergreen record shows the experiment running in reverse. No public ally appeared with enough force to change the room in time, and so every private doubter stayed a minority of one. And the third component is the theorem this episode is named for. The capture of an institution is never a contest between a majority. It's a contest between certainty and comfort, between a small group for whom the cause is sacred, who will show up, escalate, and absorb costs indefinitely, and a large group with mild preferences, each member of which runs a private calculation. Is this fight worth my job, my reputation, my afternoon? Run that math one person at a time, and it comes out the same way every time. The certain minority doesn't need to outnumber anyone. It needs to outcost them. Institutions don't fall to majorities. They fall to whoever is willing to be loudest, longest, while everyone else calculates. Now lift the theorem out of Olympia because nothing in it mentions a college. Urban's frame is immunology. Healthy institutions carry a high-rung immune system, the norms that answer speech with speech, protect honest error, and keep people and ideas separable. Tenure is an antibody. Peer review is an antibody. So is the older, unwritten one, the colleague who says out loud, hang on, that's not fair to him. Capture doesn't begin when the zealous show up. The zealous are always somewhere in the bloodstream, in every direction. Capture begins the first time the immune system declines to fire, because each individual antibody did its own private cost benefit and concluded that this particular infection was somebody else's job. So, run the general form. Any institution whose members privately disagree but publicly comply is already captured. The only question is by whom, and the answer changes with the cost structure. You watch this exact theorem run in episode 6, where in red, party figures who publicly denounced their eventual nominee later endorsed him. One rational calculation at a time, because the certain minority in the primaries could outcost the comfortable majority everywhere else. Same physics. Different flag. If you nodded along in episode 6 and flinched tonight, or the reverse, sit with which one and why? And notice what showed up at Evergreen 2 weeks after the first closure. A right-wing group held a rally on the campus, and campus activities were suspended again. That's the golem law from episode 3, completing itself. A golem's favorite gift is a rival golem, and a campus in crisis is a feeding ground for both. By midsummer, the college wasn't a battlefield between students and a professor anymore. It was raw material for two national outrage machines, each of which needed Evergreen to mean something for their side, and neither of which would be paying the enrollment costs, the death threat costs, the years of cleanup. The machinery from episode 6 ate the story on both channels. It always does. Because here's who this episode was about the whole time. And it wasn't the marchers, and it wasn't the professor. It was the middle, the faculty and staff who watched it happen, held opinions we'll never know, and did the math. And before you judge them, do what the season keeps asking and put your own name in. You have been in the meeting. The one where a thing was said that half the room privately thought was wrong. You could feel it, the particular quality of that silence. And you looked at the cost accurately and you said nothing. So there's a meeting I still think about years later where I had the objection loaded and the calculation came back not worth it. And the person the silence landed on was not me. My math was correct. That's what's wrong with it. The capture of an institution is made of exactly that moment, multiplied. Not the zealots. Every institution has zealots in every direction, always. The variable is the middle. A room where the middle speaks is uncapturable. Episode 3 proved one voice can be enough. A room where the middle calculates is already gone. It's just waiting to find out who its king is. One more thing about that calculation, because it's about to be the whole story. The middle stays silent when the cost of speaking is high, and over the last 15 years, we handed every person on Earth a device that can raise that cost without limit. One sentence, said carelessly, or said correctly to the wrong wind, can now find you anywhere from any scale, forever. Next time, December 20th, 2013, a woman with 170 followers boards an 11-hour flight, and while she's asleep over the Atlantic, the whole internet finds her. On December 20th, 2013, a 30-year-old PR executive named Justine Sacco was working through a layover at Heathrow, tweeting small, sour jokes about international travel to her 170 followers. Before boarding an 11-hour flight to Cape Town, she posted one more, going to Africa. Hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding. I'm white. Then she turned off her phone, and for 11 hours she did not exist. What she meant, she later told John Ronson on the record, and Ronson's reporting supports this account. It was a joke about the bubble, mocking the obliviousness of privileged Americans from inside the character of one. What the internet read was the character minus the quotation marks. A Gawker editor with a big following amplified it. And while she slept over the Atlantic, the machine we built this season out of sorted tribes, unanimous rooms, and attention economics found its perfect toy. A villain who could not respond. On a timer everyone could watch. The hashtag was #has Justine landed yet? And by the time her plane began its descent, it was the #1 trend in the world. Strangers tracked her flight. A man went to the Cape Town airport to photograph her arrival and got the shot. A woman turning on her phone. She was fired, of course. Her employer had condemned the tweet before she landed. 170 followers when she took off. The most famous woman on the internet when the wheels touched down. Now, here's why this episode exists, and it isn't her story. You already know her story. It's famous. The story nobody tells is the other side of the ledger. Roughly 100,000 tweets, retweets, quips, pile-on jokes. Each one a flick of a thumb, most of whose authors would go on to remember her tweet forever and their own contribution not at all. That's the accurate version of a story. One bad joke and a pile-on measured at roughly 100,000 tweets, costing each participant almost nothing. You remember her tweet? Do you remember your retweet? To understand what those thumbs were doing, rewind 4 years. Early social media was, and People forget this. Nice. John Ronson, who wrote the book on what came next, described early Twitter as a place of radical de-shaming. People confessed to embarrassing things and strangers said me too. Then, around 2009 and 2010, the platforms installed or normalized the buttons, like share, retweet, and began making engagement visible, countable, and rankable. Facebook was already sorting feeds. Twitter's main ranked timeline came later, but the direction of travel was clear. Social expression was becoming a scored game. Innocent little buttons. But you've had 8 episodes of this season, so watch what the scoreboards actually did. They turned expression into a game, and the primitive mind, which has kept score of status since the savannah, sat down at the table and never got up. And one winning strategy, as a sizable body of research has since confirmed, is an insight, and it is in joy. It's strong emotion, moral anger above all, and tribal anger above that. The machine from episode 6, the one that discovered war rates better than governance, this is the same discovery, miniaturized, installed in every pocket, and paying out in hearts and followers 100 times a day. The cudgel from episode 4, the ancient technology of shame, the one liberal society spent 2 centuries caging, had just been industrialized, gamified, and handed back to everyone. And here's the half of this story that has to stay true, or the episode curdles into a lecture. The megaphone worked. For as long as power has existed, there's been a glitch in the liberal games. The abusive boss, the predatory doctor, the untouchable local tyrant, protected not by law, but by the fact that accusing them cost everything and accomplished nothing. Social media patched the glitch. A voiceless employee could suddenly tell her story past every gatekeeper, rally strangers, move advertisers, topple a man no institution would touch. Ronson called it the democratization of justice, and in its best moments, that's what it was. Some of the people the internet has shamed had it coming in ways courts never delivered. The problem was never that the cudgel can't land on the guilty. The problem is that it has no aim mechanism. No definition of the crime, no proportionality, no defense, no appeal, and thanks to search engines, no statute of limitations. It's a justice system with exactly one verdict and one sentence, administered by whoever is angriest, soonest, in the largest numbers. Sometimes that lands on a predator. Sometimes it lands on a woman asleep on a plane. The machine cannot tell the difference because nothing in it is built to ask. When the cudgel is used deliberately, and it is every day by movements of every color, Urban maps the process in 3 steps. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Step 1, find a villain, and if the offense is too small, resize it. Stretch a damning label until it fits. Clip the quote, skip the context. The master rule, and it's ancient, is guilty because accused. Margaret Atwood, who has watched revolutions eat their own in more than 1 century's fiction, points out that this move kicks in during the terror and virtue phase of every purge and adds the sentence that makes it the seasons. The list is long, and left and right have both indulged. Step 2, destroy. One account fires. A bigger account amplifies. The algorithm, which measures activity and not truth, cranks the volume. The news engine writes it up because it's trending. The write-ups trend. And then the part nobody budgets for, the search engine, which optimizes for relevance and never forgets, quietly binds the whole storm to the person's name, so that the worst week of their life becomes permanently the first thing anyone learns about them. A writer using the name Barrett Wilson, confessing his own years as a shamer, explained the fuel from the inside. Every accusation he threw got a rush of hearts and stars, and he added, the people applauding were playing their own game. Because a fear of being targeted by the mob induces us to signal publicly that we are part of it. Read that twice. The mob is held together by fear of the mob. Step 3, make them radioactive. Guilt by association, defend the target, employ the target, even suggest the punishment has gone too far, and you're next. This is what turns a shaming into a quarantine. The point isn't just to punish one person. It's to make them expensive to stand near, so that even the people who privately think the mob is wrong will do what the Evergreen faculty did, what the King's Guards did, what you and I have done. The math, the silence. But the real product of a public shaming was never the shaming. Episode 3 taught you a room runs on outer selves. Episode 8 showed you a campus learning offense from one man's example. Now scale it. Every pylon has 3 casts: the target, the participants, and the audience, which is everybody else, watching and learning the tariff schedule. The learning shows up in the data. In 2020, a national survey found 62% of Americans saying the political climate prevents them from saying things they believe. A majority of Democrats, a majority of independents, a larger majority of Republicans. Nearly every political group, in fact, except strong liberals, using the survey's own category and rising across the board. By 2022, a New York Times Commission poll found 84% of Americans calling this fear a serious national problem, and more than half saying that in the past year they personally had held their tongue. Sit with what those numbers describe. A country with some of the strongest speech protections ever written, where most citizens on every side report being afraid to say what they think. King Mustache never passed a law here. He didn't need one. The executions are televised. They're searchable. And the soft cudgel has exactly one weakness. It only works if everyone keeps letting it, which is why every silent watcher isn't just a victim of the fear. Or its power supply. So, the audit. And this week I did it literally. I scrolled my own history until I found one. A pylon I joined years ago. One retweet plus a joke of my own, aimed at a stranger whose offense I could not accurately describe to you today. I can still remember faintly how it felt, which is the damning part, because what it felt like was justice, and what it cost me was nothing. And Ronson has the phrase for the arithmetic I help perform. A disconnect between the severity of the crime and the gleeful savagery of the punishment. Here's the coda to the famous story, the part almost nobody knows because mobs don't do follow-ups. Justine Sacco rebuilt. Years later, she was rehired into the same corporate family that fired her, eventually running communications for one of its biggest companies. The internet that knew her name for a week never learned the ending because the machine has no mechanism for endings, only beginnings. Her worst joke is still the first thing her name retrieves. Somewhere in a data center, my little contribution to someone's worst week is still retrievable too. So is yours. The cudgel in your pocket has no safety, no memory of its own swings, and no owner. That last part was supposed to be the good news. 9 episodes, 1 toolkit, rungs, runes, golems, spirals, cudgels. You can see them everywhere now, in the news, in your feeds, in the people around you. And that sentence I just said should worry you, because there's one place the toolkit points last, and it isn't at the people around you. Next time, the finale. What happens when a framework for diagnosing low-rung thinking becomes the most satisfying weapon a low-rung thinker ever held? And the question the whole season has been walking you toward, while you were sorting everyone onto the ladder, ... Which rung were you standing on? 9 episodes ago, I taught you a vocabulary, and last week I used it to hurt someone. It was a text argument, the kind you've been picturing all season, because you've had it too. Someone I know said something about a political story, and I felt the old heat come up, episode 2 heat, and here's what I did with all these beautiful tools. I typed, "You're being an attorney right now. There's no evidence that would change your mind, and you know it." And the terms were accurate. That's what I need you to sit with. I diagnosed him correctly, in the season's own language, and I did it for the oldest reason there is, to win. To make him small and me tall. The ladder wasn't a mirror in my hand. It was the sharpest club I have ever owned, and it came with a silencer because it sounds like insight going in. And there's a second replay I owe you. Go back and watch episode 6 the way I did this week, as its editor. There's a version of that episode 3 drafts back that would have gone viral. And I know exactly which tribe would have shared it. And I know how good the numbers would have felt. And there were 2 full days when I told myself the cuts I'd made were about pacing and every skill. This season taught you I possess in the professional strength. So did every propagandist in history. So here's the finale, and it's a trial. The defendant is the framework, the books, and this season's, because we're the same project now. The charge that a system for detecting low-rung thinking is, in practice, a luxury weapon for low-rung thinking. I'll prosecute it at full strength, then I'll defend it. And then I'm going to refuse to deliver the verdict you're expecting. The prosecution's star witness is real, and he's published. Nathan Robinson, editor of Current Affairs, reviewed the book within weeks of its release under the title, Why Centrism is Morally Indefensible. And I'm going to state his case the way episode 10 of this season is obligated to. So, well, that he'd sign it? Robinson's argument runs like this. Urban spent 6 years and 700 pages asking what's our problem. And the answer he came up with was, in effect, that people are rude to each other online, with the social justice left cast as the leading threat. 1 chapter for the right's collapse, 3 for the left's excesses. Meanwhile, Robinson's list, and it's a fair list. The book has nothing to say about nuclear proliferation, climate, global wealth inequality, medical bankruptcy, opioid deaths, police brutality, mass incarceration, unaffordable housing, voter suppression, and the risk of world war. How out of touch with the basic facts of the world do you have to be, he writes, to weight things that way? And the latter itself, he argues, is a machine for caring about tone over substance. It awards Ronald Reagan high-rung marks for gracious rhetoric, while the policies behind the rhetoric wrecked real lives. Civility elevated over justice, which is exactly what Martin Luther King warned about in the Birmingham jail letter, where the white moderate, devoted to order over justice, is named as the great stumbling block. And one more, the one that stings. A book that preaches humility on every page, Robinson says, drips with arrogant certitude. The framework never seems to catch its own author, and the prosecution has a second witness, the season you just watched. Because run our own episode 7 test on the framework itself. What happens when you disagree with the latter? If you reject the diagnosis that you're thinking low-rung ... that's your primitive mind talking. The fog hides itself. Remember, we told you that in episode 2, which means the framework contains a clause that converts every objection into a symptom. We spent episode 7 damning that exact structure when it appeared in White Fragility. A claim that no possible response can falsify isn't functioning as a claim. Our rule, the latter, is unfalsifiable in hostile hands. And Robinson would add, whose hands do you imagine are holding it? Readers who locate themselves on the bottom rungs? Nobody has ever read this book and found themselves in the zealot. The latter flatters every single person who climbs it, and a framework that flatters everyone who adopts it doesn't spread because it's true. It spreads because it feels wonderful. One more count, and it's the one serious people on both sides file. The framework's architecture is symmetric by construction. A rung for every tribe, a golem for every color, and reality is under no obligation to be symmetric. If, at any given moment, one movement holds more power, or does more damage, or threatens more fundamental things than another, a symmetric lens will systematically misweigh that. It will find equivalence, because equivalence is what its geometry produces. We felt this all season. The balanced decisions this show made, 1 episode there, 2 here, this beat mirrored, that stat paired, were editorial choices defending against one failure mode. And every one of them risked the opposite failure mode, manufacturing a tidy symmetry the world may not contain. Which side of that ledger we actually erred on is exactly the kind of question the framework itself cannot answer. Because the framework is the thing in question. That's the prosecution. I have no rebuttal that makes it disappear, and I'd ask you to notice any relief you're feeling that it's over. Now, the defense, and it's not a technicality. It's a reading instruction. The book's final section is called Changing Course, and it's where Urban does the thing his critics say he never does. He confesses. During the writing, he says he caught himself judging academic papers by whether they confirmed his hypotheses. He describes arguments where his ego took the wheel, where he was only listening in order to reload. And he writes the sentence, the whole framework depends on an unproductive argument. Always feels like arguing with a brick wall, even when you're the brick wall. His closing instruction isn't go diagnose your uncle. It's the airline rule. Put your own mask on first. Audit yourself. Play the why game with your own beliefs. And before you claim to disagree with anyone, state their case so well they say, yes, that's what I believe, which is the standard I just tried to meet with Robinson. Because the defense of a framework is using it properly in public. So the defense says the charge describes the weapon, not the tool. Pointed inward, this vocabulary does something almost nothing else can do. It gives you a handle on your own machinery. You cannot unknow the attack test once you have it. You've caught yourself this season? I know because I have, and I built the episodes. The framework's honest use was never diagnosis of others. Every misuse in the prosecution's file is the outward use. And the book, read fairly, keeps telling you to turn it around. The last chapter is not about them. It was never about them. And now you're waiting for me to reconcile them because that's what episode 10s do. I won't, because they don't reconcile. Both beats are true at the same time. And the reason is something this season has taught over and over without saying it plainly. Tools don't carry their instructions inside them. Nothing in the framework, nothing in the book, nothing in these 10 episodes physically enforces the inward use. The vocabulary performs identically in honest and dishonest hands, like Carnegie's techniques, like the cudgel, like every instrument this channel has ever examined. It's a mirror you can hold up to your own face or angle to reflect the light into someone else's eyes, and the mirror cannot tell which you're doing. Worse, episode 9 taught you the economics. The outward use pays, instantly, in hearts and stars and the warm certainty of the diagnosis. The inward use costs every time and pays off slowly, in private, where no algorithm can see it. So the default setting of every tool in this season is outward, not because you're bad, because you're priced. And if you want to know which way you're currently holding it, there's a 10-second audit for that too, in the season's own style. Count your diagnoses from the last month. Every time you thought or typed that someone was in an echo chamber, being tribal, thinking low-rung. Now count how many of those diagnoses had your own name on them. If the first number is large and the second is 0, you don't own a mirror. You own the club and you've been calling it a mirror and it has felt, I bet everything, like insight every single time. The book can't make you use it as a mirror. Neither can I. That's the verdict. There isn't one. There's only a user. Which brings me to you one last time. For 9 episodes, you've been sorting. Don't pretend otherwise. It's what the season trained you to do. Your uncle went on a rung somewhere around episode 2. Your group chat got sorted in episode 3. By episode 6, you were fluent. And by episode 7, you were fast. Every day this season handed you filed someone under. I watched the comments. I helped. So while you were doing all that sorting, which rung were you standing on? Feel the reflex? The one that's already composing the answer. Well, I was watching a series about metacognition, so probably a high one. Episode 2 told you exactly what instant, comfortable certainty is evidence of. The fog's first job is hiding the fog. The most seductive low-rung thought in the world is, I'm one of the high-rung ones. It's the primitive mind's best costume. The higher mind's clothes, worn indoors, in front of a mirror it refuses to look at. Here's the last thing I can give you, and it isn't absolution. The test was never whether you can spot low-rung thinking. You can now. You could pass any quiz on this season, and so could every person you're about to argue with online. The test is whether you can spot it with your own name attached in the moment while it's warm, and that test isn't gradable from out here. No episode can see inside your next argument. No framework survives contact with a person determined to be flattered by it. So the season ends here, one sentence short of where you want it to. You want to hear that you've passed, that watching was the work, that understanding the machinery means you're no longer inside it. And that's the one sentence I can't say because I don't know it, and neither does the book, and neither right now do you. The moth never finds out it's circling a bulb. You get to find out. That was always the whole difference. And finding out is not a thing you watch, it's a thing you do next.